On the 15th of August 1914, a cargo steamer named the Ancon crossed from the Atlantic to the Pacific through a channel cut across the Isthmus of Panama, and the world called it an American triumph. Theodore Roosevelt had already claimed credit for the achievement in blunter terms than any president before or since, telling an audience in 1911 that he had taken the isthmus and let Congress debate the matter afterward. The canal became the signature of American engineering power, a 50-mile passage that cut months off the voyage between New York and San Francisco, and announced, more clearly than any battleship, that the United States now intervened in world commerce as it pleased. That is the version taught in classrooms and repeated in documentaries about American ambition. What it leaves out is that the United States did not build a canal route from nothing. It bought one, at a fraction of what had already been spent to carve it, from a French company that had collapsed 9 years earlier in the largest financial scandal the Third Republic had ever seen. 800,000 French citizens had already lost their savings on that same stretch of jungle before a single American dollar changed hands. The canal that opened in 1914 was not simply engineered, it was salvaged, and the terms of that salvage, who structured them, who profited from them, and who never saw a centime of it again, tell a different story than the one carved into the monuments at either end of the canal today. That story starts not in Washington but in Paris, with a company that had already succeeded once and believed, wrongly, that success in one desert made success in another jungle a formality. And it does not end with the champagne toasts of 1914, so much as it disappears into a set of ledgers that were never fully open to the public that paid for them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story begins in 1881, 7 years before anyone in Washington seriously entertained building a canal at all. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat and promoter who had built the Suez Canal a decade earlier, formed the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique and raised money directly from the French public through bond sales advertised in newspapers across the country. Even Suez had nearly failed to find its financing at first, rescued only when the British government bought up the Egyptian Khedive's shares in the Canal Company in 1875, after Cairo ran short of cash, a detail that rarely made it into the prospectuses de Lesseps circulated for his second canal. He did not need engineers to sell the Panama idea. He needed his own name, and after Suez it was worth more in Paris than any technical survey could be. De Lesseps was 75 years old when the company began digging, and he carried the confidence of a man who had already moved 100 miles of Egyptian desert. Panama, he assumed, would yield the same way. In 1879, at an international engineering congress convened in Paris under his own chairmanship, a French engineer named Adolphe Gaudin de Lepinay proposed a canal built with locks and an artificial lake, a design that would have required roughly a quarter of the excavation a sea-level channel demanded. The Congress, packed with delegates who deferred to de Lesseps rather than to the handful of men who had actually surveyed the isthmus, voted for the sea-level plan instead. Suez had been flat desert. Panama was mountainous jungle, cut by a river that flooded without warning, with soil that behaved like liquid under monsoon rain. Several of the company's own chief engineers resigned in protest over the decision, understanding what the shareholders in Lyon and Marseille did not, that the terrain made the sea-level target close to impossible with the equipment of the 1880s. Gaudin de Lepinay himself left the project altogether, rather than work under a design he considered doomed, and his lock and lake proposal sat largely forgotten in the Congress records until American engineers, starting almost from scratch 2 decades later, and unaware they were repeating a French idea their predecessors had already voted down, arrived independently at nearly the same solution. Disease did what engineering miscalculation could not finish alone. Yellow fever and malaria killed workers on the isthmus at a rate the company's Paris offices consistently underreported to its own investors, with company mortality figures that outside observers at the time considered implausibly low given what visitors to the hospitals in Panama City and Cologne actually described. Estimates of the dead across the French construction period run past 20,000, drawn from a workforce recruited heavily from the Caribbean, whose deaths were recorded, when they were recorded at all, with less care than the deaths of French engineers. Company hospitals were, by several contemporary accounts, themselves breeding grounds for the mosquitoes nobody yet understood were the actual vector, since physicians of the period still blamed bad air and set the legs of hospital beds in trays of water specifically to keep ants away from patients, unaware they were creating ideal mosquito nurseries a few feet from the sick. It would take the American Army physician William Gorgas, drawing on Walter Reed's yellow fever research from Cuba, to bring the disease under control after 1904, a scientific advance the French project simply never had access to, and one that later American accounts would credit almost entirely to superior organization rather than to a two-decade gap in medical knowledge that had nothing to do with either country's engineers. Workers who signed on for a standard contract sometimes did not survive to see it expire, and the company's own hospital admission ledgers, when later examined by outside physicians, showed readmission and mortality patterns far worse than anything the annual reports sent to Paris ever disclosed to the bondholders funding the work. The French company kept raising money to keep pace with the disaster in the meantime. Between 1881 and its collapse, it issued bond after bond to a French public that trusted the name attached to Suez, and by 1888 the company had spent close to 1.5 billion francs and excavated less than half of what the sea-level design required. In February of 1889, the Compagnie Universelle filed for bankruptcy. It remains, measured against the money involved and the number of ordinary citizens who lost everything, one of the largest corporate collapses in French history to that point. What followed the bankruptcy was not simply financial ruin. It was exposure of exactly how the company had kept selling bonds to a public that should have been told, years earlier, that the project could not succeed on its announced terms. A French parliamentary inquiry and subsequent criminal proceedings established that company directors had paid bribes, channeled through the financier Baron Jacques de Reinach and his associate Cornelius Herds, to members of the French press and to sitting deputies in the National Assembly to secure authorization for a lottery bond scheme that kept fresh capital flowing into a project the company's own engineers already knew was failing. Investigators eventually compiled a list of dozens of deputies who had accepted payments to vote for the lottery bill, a list that became known in the Paris press simply as the checkbook, and its publication in stages through 1892 kept the scandal alive in French politics for years. The Panama Affair, as it became known, reached into the cabinet. Ministers resigned. De Reinach died before he could be tried, in circumstances investigators at the time treated as suspicious. Cornelius Herds fled to England and never returned to face prosecution. Georges Clemenceau, then a rising figure in French politics, saw his own career nearly ended by his association with Herds and did not recover his political standing for close to a decade. Gustave Eiffel, whose company had been contracted to design the canal's locks after the sea-level plan was finally abandoned too late to matter, was convicted of fraud alongside de Lesseps and his son, though the conviction against Eiffel was later overturned on a technicality. De Lesseps himself, by then in his late 80s and reportedly no longer fully aware of the proceedings against him, was convicted and sentenced to prison, a sentence never actually carried out. 800,000 French bondholders, ordinary citizens who had bought government-endorsed paper on the strength of the Suez name, were left holding certificates for a canal that did not exist and a company that no longer did. Many held on to the paper for years afterward anyway, unwilling to accept a total loss, which is precisely what made the certificates worth buying cheap from the ones who finally gave up. Historians have since put their total losses at more than $200 million in the money of the period, a figure that dwarfs anything the Americans would eventually pay to inherit what was left of the project. That should have been the end of the story. It was not, because the concession itself, the legal right to build a canal across the isthmus, still had value even after the company holding it went bankrupt. In 1894, a successor entity called the Compagnie Nouvelle du Canal de Panama was formed specifically to preserve that concession and, eventually, to sell it. The new company kept a skeleton crew digging, not because anyone in Paris believed the canal would be finished under French ownership, but because Colombian law required continuous work to keep the concession alive, and each renewal of that concession had to be purchased from the government in Bogotá at additional cost, a slow drain on whatever capital the Compagnie Nouvelle had left. Every shovel of dirt moved after 1894 was moved to protect an asset for sale, not to complete a canal. That asset, decades of excavation, engineering surveys, a rail line across the isthmus, and the concession rights themselves, was the only thing standing between the surviving French shareholders and a total loss. The new company's shareholders were, by this point, overwhelmingly the speculators and banks who had bought up the original bondholders' claims rather than the original bondholders themselves. So the incentive driving every decision the Compagnie Nouvelle made from 1894 onward was recovery for owners who had entered the story only after the ruin, not for the families who had financed the digging in the first place. Somebody needed to buy the concession outright, and only one government in the world had both the money and the strategic appetite to want it. The man who engineered that sale was not a diplomat. He was a New York corporate lawyer named William Nelson Cromwell, a founding partner of the firm that still carries his name, Sullivan and Cromwell, and one of the highest-paid attorneys in the country by the turn of the century. The Compagnie Nouvelle retained Cromwell specifically to secure an American buyer, and Cromwell approached the assignment less like litigation and more like a political campaign. He contributed to the Republican National Committee at a moment when the party's finance chairman happened to be deciding which canal route the incoming administration would favor. He courted senators individually, keeping a suite at Washington's Arlington Hotel for the purpose, and he placed favorable stories about the Panama route in American newspapers, while working to discredit the rival option under serious consideration in Washington, a canal through Nicaragua that the Isthmian Canal Commission, headed by Admiral John Walker, had actually recommended in its first report of November 1901, specifically because the Panama concession looked legally troubled, and the asking price, then fixed by the Compagnie Nouvelle at roughly $109 million, looked far too high next to the Nicaragua alternative. He arranged for a stream of pro-Panama editorials and pamphlets to appear under the bylines of ostensibly independent commentators, several of whom the Compagnie Nouvelle was paying at the same time without ever disclosing the arrangement, a practice indistinguishable from what a later century would call an undisclosed influence campaign. Cromwell's own fee for the work he performed became its own subject of controversy years later, when a Senate committee pressed him for an accounting of his compensation that he was reluctant to provide in full, and no complete public record of what he was actually paid has ever surfaced. Working alongside Cromwell, though not always in coordination with him, was Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer who had worked on the original canal project and who had personally invested a portion of his own fortune in Compagnie Nouvelle shares. Once the Walker Commission's first report favored Nicaragua on cost grounds alone, the Compagnie Nouvelle's board, under pressure from both Cromwell and Bunau-Varilla, abruptly cut its asking price from $109 million to $40 million, the precise ceiling Congress would later write into the Spooner Act. The commission reversed itself within weeks and issued a second report recommending Panama instead, a recommendation that tracked the new asking price closely enough that several members of Congress said so openly during the floor debate that followed. Members of the commission who had signed the first report never fully explained, in the surviving record, what new engineering evidence had changed their minds between the two documents, since the terrain and the disease risk on the isthmus had not changed at all in the intervening months. Only the price had. Bunau-Varilla ran his own parallel lobbying campaign in Washington, and one episode from that campaign survives as one of the more memorable pieces of evidence for how the final Senate vote actually went. When the debate over Panama versus Nicaragua reached its final days in June of 1902, Bunau-Varilla obtained Nicaraguan postage stamps depicting Mount Momotombo mid-eruption and mailed one to every member of the Senate, a visual argument that Nicaragua sat on volcanic ground unsuitable for a permanent canal. Nicaragua had not in fact experienced significant volcanic activity in decades, and the eruption pictured on the stamp had occurred years before the stamp was ever printed, but the image did its work. The Senate voted for Panama by a margin of 8 votes. Congress passed the Spooner Act that same year, authorizing the president to purchase the French concession and equipment for up to $40 million, provided the United States could secure the legal rights to build and control the route, either through Colombia, which held sovereignty over Panama at the time, or, failing that, through Nicaragua as a fallback. Secretary of State John Hay opened negotiations with Colombia's charge d'affaires in Washington, Tomás Herrán, and the two men signed the Hay-Herrán Treaty in January of 1903, granting the United States a lease on a canal zone 6 miles wide in exchange for $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. The government in Bogotá, under President José Manuel Marroquín, faced a Senate that viewed the terms as a giveaway, since Colombia stood to receive far less than the Compagnie Nouvelle itself was collecting for a concession over exactly the same ground. The Colombian Senate rejected the treaty that August, unanimously, judging the compensation too low and the surrender of sovereignty too great for a concession that, left alone, Colombia might eventually sell for far more once the French rights expired on their own timetable and reverted to Bogotá outright. Colombian legislators who voted against the treaty were not opposed to a canal in principle. Several said openly that they expected a better offer once the Compagnie Nouvelle's concession lapsed on its own and Bogotá no longer had to split the proceeds with a French company at all. Cromwell's client now had a $40 million sale hanging on a treaty that Bogotá had just refused to ratify, and Panama, a province with its own long history of failed secession attempts stretching back decades, suddenly looked to men in Washington and New York like the more promising path forward. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened next has been described in American textbooks for more than a century as a spontaneous uprising of Panamanian nationalists against Bogotá's neglect, and there is real truth in the resentment that had built for decades between Panama and the distant government in Colombia. But the timing, 3 weeks after the Colombian Senate's rejection, and the presence of the USS Nashville off the coast of Cologne before the uprising even began point to a revolution that had support well beyond Panama's own borders. Roosevelt did not order the uprising directly. No cable survives instructing Panamanian conspirators to act. American naval vessels were positioned to prevent Colombian troops from landing to suppress it, under standing orders that cited an 1846 treaty obligation to keep the Isthmus transit route open, an obligation Washington had never previously interpreted quite so conveniently. On the 3rd of November 1903, a junta led by the physician Manuel Amador Guerrero declared Panama's independence in the city's central plaza, having already cut the telegraph line to Bogota to delay word from reaching the Colombian garrison stationed on the isthmus. Colombian troops that landed at Colón on the same day found themselves unable to reach the capital by rail at all, because the Panama Railroad, a company whose stock the Compagnie Nouvelle itself partly controlled, declined to run the train that would have carried them across, citing a shortage of cars that lifted the moment the crisis had passed. Their commanding officers were persuaded, with a payment of gold reportedly drawn from funds Bunau Varilla himself had advanced against his own Compagnie Nouvelle holdings, to withdraw rather than force the issue. Bogotá's government, informed only after the fact, protested to every European capital it could reach that a great power had orchestrated the loss of a province, protests that found little audience once Washington had already extended recognition. The United States recognized the new republic within 3 days, faster than it had recognized any government in its history to that point. Bunau Varilla, who had no formal authority from the Panamanian junta beyond a verbal understanding and his own considerable ambition, appointed himself Panama's minister to Washington before the junta's actual delegation had even left the isthmus. On the 18th of November 1903, working through the night in his hotel room before the signing, he drafted a treaty that went further than the junta had actually instructed him to negotiate, and the next day he sat down with Hay and signed it, granting the United States far more than Colombia had ever refused: a canal zone 10 miles wide instead of Heron's 6, American authority within that zone described as though the United States possessed it in perpetuity as if it were sovereign territory, and the right to intervene militarily to maintain order whenever Washington judged it necessary. Panama's own negotiators, 4 men who had crossed by ship from the isthmus expecting to negotiate the treaty themselves, arrived in Washington after it was already signed. They objected to several of its terms, particularly the perpetuity clause and the scope of the military intervention right, terms broader than anything the junta back in Panama City had authorized Bunau Varilla to concede. Bunau Varilla told them the choice was to ratify what he had already agreed to on their behalf, or risk the United States withdrawing its recognition of a republic that was, at that point, barely 2 weeks old, and entirely dependent on American protection from Colombian reconquest. Faced with that ultimatum from a man who was not even a citizen of the country he claimed to represent, the junta cabled its approval rather than test how firm the threat actually was. They ratified it. With the treaty ratified, the payment that Cromwell had spent 3 years arranging could finally proceed. In 1904, the United States paid the Compagnie Nouvelle du Canal de Panama the full $40 million authorized under the Spooner Act, the largest single payment the American government had made to a private entity up to that point in its history. J.P. Morgan and Company served as the fiscal depositary for the transaction, receiving the funds from the United States Treasury and handling their distribution to the French company's creditors and shareholders through its offices in New York and Paris, a role that placed the country's most powerful private bank at the center of a transfer larger than most nations' entire annual budgets at the time. The payment itself moved as a treasury draft rather than as coin, converted into francs on the Paris exchange in stages over several months, so that the sale would not itself move the currency markets it was settling into. A technical courtesy, the Compagnie Nouvelle's remaining creditors were rarely extended during the company's own collapse 15 years earlier. On paper, this was the recovery that 800,000 ruined French bondholders had waited 15 years for. In practice, most of them had already sold their nearly worthless certificates for pennies on the franc during the years after the 1889 collapse, to speculators willing to gamble that the concession would eventually find a buyer. By the time the $40 million reached Paris and New York in 1904, a considerable share of it went not to the original French families who had financed the digging, but to the intermediaries and financiers who had bought up their claims at a fraction of face value once everyone assumed the project was dead. A family that had held 5,000 francs of the original 1882 bonds and sold out in despair a decade later for a tenth of that value never saw a share of the $40 million at all. The buyer who took the certificates off their hands did. Exactly how much of the $40 million went where became a genuine controversy, not a settled account. In 1908, the New York World, under Joseph Pulitzer, published a series of articles alleging that a small syndicate connected to prominent American financiers, including Douglas Robinson, who was married to Roosevelt's own sister, had accumulated Compagnie Nouvelle shares, without disclosure, before the sale was finalized, and had profited enormously once the $40 million was distributed. Roosevelt, furious at the implication that his administration's Panama policy had enriched insiders inside his own household, pursued a criminal libel case against the World and its editors, an extraordinary use of federal prosecution against a newspaper reporting on a government transaction. A separate Senate committee took up the same question of where the money had actually gone, summoning Cromwell and several New York bankers to testify under oath about share transfers that had taken place in the 2 years before the payment was made. Its members found the available company registers incomplete enough that they could not fully trace the ownership chain themselves, a gap the committee's own final report acknowledged rather than resolved. Witnesses recalled transactions from memory that the underlying paperwork no longer supported, and more than one banker told the committee that the relevant transfer books had simply not survived. The libel case worked its way through federal courts for 3 years and was dismissed in 1911, not because the World's reporting was proven false, but because the courts found no federal jurisdiction to prosecute libel against a sitting president in the first place. The full ledger of who actually held Compagnie Nouvelle paper in the months before the sale, and what they paid for it, was never placed into the public record in complete form. What survives is the accusation, the failed prosecution, a Senate report that stopped short of a conclusion, and a payment whose final distribution has never been reconstructed in full detail by any historian since. One piece of the story did not disappear into that gap. Cromwell's law firm did not close when the Compagnie Nouvelle dissolved, or when Cromwell himself retired decades later. Sullivan and Cromwell is still in operation today, one of the most prominent corporate law firms in the world, its name attached to major cross-border transactions on every continent. 2 of its 20th-century partners, John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, went on to run American foreign policy directly, John Foster as Secretary of State and Allen as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, both men shaped early in their careers by a firm whose founding fortune traced back to a canal concession bought from a bankrupt French company. Neither brother needed to invent the practice that later defined their careers, using financial and legal instruments to hold power over foreign governments rather than open force. Cromwell had already written that practice into the correspondence files of a client that no longer existed by the time either Dulles brother made partner, files that stayed inside the firm's own archive rather than any government's, available to the partners who followed him, but not to the historians who later went looking for them. The firm's own institutional history rarely dwells on that origin. The institution that structured the deal outlasted the men who negotiated it, and outlasted the empire it helped extend across an isthmus that neither Cromwell nor his partners ever needed to visit. Panama received $10 million up front under the treaty Nouvelle had signed on its behalf, along with an annual payment of $250,000, a figure that went largely unrenegotiated for decades, despite the canal's growing strategic and commercial value. Colombia received nothing at all until 1921, when Washington finally paid Bogotá $25 million in a settlement widely understood at the time as compensation for the loss of Panama, timed not coincidentally to the same year American oil companies began seeking new concessions inside Colombian territory. The United States controlled the Canal Zone as something close to sovereign territory for most of the 20th century, a status that generated recurring friction with Panamanian governments and periodic unrest, most seriously in 1964, when riots over the right to fly the Panamanian flag inside the zone left more than 20 people dead on both sides. A new set of treaties, negotiated under Presidents Torrijos and Carter and ratified in 1977 after a bruising fight in the United States Senate that fell just short of the 2/3 margin's usual comfort zone, set a schedule for the zone's return. The debate over those treaties revived, almost word for word, the same arguments Cromwell and Nouvelle had once used to justify taking the zone in the first place, framed this time by senators who had never read the 1894 concession documents but had inherited the perpetuity clause as settled fact, and who spoke of it as though the United States had won the zone outright rather than purchased it from a bankrupt company acting on behalf of a government that never consented to the sale in the first place. Full transfer of the canal to Panamanian control took effect at the end of 1999, 96 years after Nouvelle had signed away Panamanian sovereignty over the same ground before Panama's own delegates ever had a chance to object to it. The $40 million purchase remains, on the American ledger, one of the more efficient acquisitions any government has made. An entire decade of excavation, a functioning rail line, engineering surveys covering the full length of the route, and legal rights to the concession secured for a fifth of what the Compagnie Nouvelle had originally asked, and a fraction of what French investors had actually poured into the project across 2 decades. On the French ledger, it closes an episode that had already cost the country's small investors most of what they had put in, years before the American payment ever arrived to recover any of it for the intermediaries who by then owned their claims instead. On the Colombian ledger, it records a province lost for a payment that took 18 years to arrive and never approached what either the French company or the Americans had already extracted from the same stretch of ground. And on the ledger kept by the syndicate the New York World tried and failed to fully expose, it records a return that no public register has ever confirmed in complete detail, because the paperwork that would confirm it was, by the time anyone went looking, already described by the men who held it as lost, misplaced, or simply never kept in the first place. 3 ledgers closed at 3 different times by 3 different governments, and a fourth that may never have been closed publicly at all, recording one transaction as 4 entirely different outcomes. The canal opened in 1914 to the fanfare its promoters had always promised. The Ancon's crossing was filmed, photographed, and celebrated as proof that American engineering had succeeded where French ambition had failed. It is a true statement. It leaves out most of the ledger beneath it: the 800,000 French families who never recovered what they had put in, the Colombian government that lost a province and waited nearly 2 decades for a fraction of a settlement, and the $40 million that made the American crossing possible, which traveled a route considerably harder to trace than the ship that finally sailed above it, past monuments that remember the engineering and say almost nothing about the ledger underneath. The isthmus itself did not change hands twice by accident. It changed hands twice because the men who structured the second transaction understood, better than the shareholders ruined by the first one ever had the chance to, that a concession, a treaty, and a payment can move a border as effectively as an army, and leave a far thinner paper trail behind for anyone who comes looking later to follow. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.